Do you remember that feeling you had watching He-Man? You've never fully understood where it came from, have you? You remember the transformation, the sword, Castle Grayskull, but you've never known the real story behind it all. Why it existed, how it became the biggest thing in your childhood, and why it vanished almost overnight. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to show you the complete story behind He-Man. The real story of how it was created, why it exploded bigger than Star Wars, and why it disappeared. And once you know the truth, you'll finally understand why it mattered so much. You'll see that it wasn't just a cartoon. It was something bigger that happened to an entire generation at the exact same moment. Before we go any further into this, subscribe and turn on notifications right now, because if He-Man was part of your childhood, the other stories I'm uncovering will matter to you too. Now, let's go back to where it all actually began. The story of He-Man starts with a mistake that a toy company couldn't stop thinking about. In the late 1970s, Mattel made a decision they would regret for years. They turned down the toy rights to Star Wars. They watched another company make millions while they stood on the sidelines, knowing they'd missed the biggest opportunity in toy history. So they went searching for their own hero, their own universe, their own chance to create something that could compete with what they'd lost. They looked at Conan, the Barbarian, and saw potential. Not the exact character, but the idea behind him. A muscular warrior in a world of swords and magic and raw physical power. Something that felt completely different from the space adventures that were dominating toy stores. Designers like Roger Sweet and Mark Taylor started creating sketches. Warriors with weapons, ancient castles, villains that looked dangerous and exciting. By 1982, the toys were ready. 5.5-inch action figures. Small enough for kids to hold, but detailed enough to feel important. Mattel put them on store shelves and waited for sales to take off. But there was a problem nobody had anticipated. When parents walked past those toys in stores, they were genuinely confused. The packaging showed muscular warriors and skeleton-faced villains, but there was no clear story connecting them. Who were the good guys? Who were the bad guys? Some figures looked heroic, others looked monstrous. Without context, without a narrative to explain what these characters were supposed to be, the toys just sat on shelves collecting dust. Sales weren't meeting expectations. Kids weren't asking for them. Parents weren't buying them. Mattel had created an entire toy line that nobody understood. They needed to fix this problem fast, before retailers gave up on the product completely. So they made a decision that would change everything. They called Filmation, an animation studio that specialized in TV cartoons, and asked them to do something unusual. Build a story around toys that already existed. Create a universe that would explain who these characters were and why kids should care about them. Michael Halperin wrote the first version of what would become the show's foundation, connecting the plastic figures to a larger mythology. Tom Ruegger revised and strengthened it, and by September of 1983, He-Man and the Masters of the Universe premiered on television screens across America in syndication. The response was immediate. Within 2 years, it became the #1 rated show for children aged 2 to 11. It was playing on 152 stations across the United States and reaching audiences in countries around the world. The plan had worked, but what Mattel and Filmation created together was bigger and stranger than anyone expected. Let me describe the world you entered every time that theme song started playing. Eternia wasn't like other cartoon planets you'd seen before. It wasn't pure fantasy with dragons and wizards living in castles. It wasn't pure science fiction with spaceships and laser guns. It was both, mixed together in a way that shouldn't have made sense, but somehow did. You had medieval castles sitting next to advanced technology. You had sorcerers casting ancient spells while warriors drove vehicles that looked like they came from the future. Magic and machines existed side by side on the same planet, and nobody in the show ever questioned it. That was just how Eternia worked. The laws of that world allowed for contradictions that would have broken other stories. The royal family ruled from a city called Eternos. The planet had locations with names that stuck in your memory, even if you only heard them once. Mount Eternia, the Sands of Time, the Demon Zone. Each place suggested a larger world beyond what you saw in any single episode. But at the center of everything, dominating the landscape and the mythology, was Castle Grayskull. If you remember one image from He-Man, it's probably that castle, shaped like a giant skull, ancient and mysterious, sitting alone in a barren wasteland. It looked like something from a nightmare, but the show told you it held something more valuable than anything else in the entire universe. Pure power. Unlimited power. The kind of power that would let someone control all of Eternia and everything beyond it. The castle was protected by a woman called the Sorceress, who could transform into a falcon named Zoar. The show explained that in the distant past, the castle had been called the Hall of Wisdom. Ancient beings known as the Elders had transformed it to protect a magical orb that contained incredible energy. Whoever controlled Castle Grayskull would have the ability to reshape reality itself. That single piece of mythology gave weight to everything else in the show. It made every conflict feel important. It answered the question that every episode asked, what are they fighting over? And the answer was always the same. Ultimate power. Control of the universe. Everything. That's why every episode centered on the same basic conflict. Someone wanted that castle. Someone else had to protect it. The villain trying to take that castle was Skeletor. Blue skin stretched tight over bone, a skull for a face, a voice that was somehow threatening and comedic at the same time. He lived in Snake Mountain, a fortress carved into rock that looked exactly like its name, and he commanded a group of warriors and monsters he called the Evil Warriors. Beastman, a savage creature who controlled animals. Evil Lyn, a sorceress with her own ambitions. Trapjaw, a cyborg with a mechanical jaw and interchangeable weapons. Merman, a fish-like humanoid from the oceans. They all followed Skeletor because he promised them power and position when he finally won. In the early comic books that came packaged with the toys, the writers described Skeletor as invading from another dimension through something called a war rift. In the Filmation cartoon, they made him slightly different, more theatrical, more prone to emotional outbursts. He would come up with elaborate plans to steal the castle's secrets, and when those plans inevitably failed, he would rage and scream and swear revenge. His visual design came from Mark Taylor's original sketches for the toy line, but his personality, his motivation, his obsession, that all came from the show's writers. And his goal never changed across 130 episodes. He wanted Castle Grayskull. He wanted ultimate power, and he would never, ever stop trying to get it. Standing in his way, stopping him episode after episode, was He-Man. But here's the part that made the show different from every other cartoon about invincible heroes on television at that time. He-Man wasn't always He-Man. Most of the time, he was someone completely different, someone who appeared weak, someone who seemed like a disappointment, someone named Prince Adam. Adam was the son of King Randor and Queen Marlena, the rulers of Eternia. By birth and position, he should have been a strong prince, a warrior in training, someone his father could be proud of and rely on. But he wasn't any of those things. Or at least, he didn't appear to be. He seemed lazy. He avoided combat training. He made clumsy mistakes. He acted like he didn't care about royal responsibilities or the defense of the kingdom. His father often looked at him with visible frustration, wondering why his son couldn't be more like the heroes and warriors who served the royal family. But it was all an act, a carefully maintained disguise, a way to keep the real secret hidden from everyone around him. When danger appeared, when Skeletor launched an attack, when Eternia needed saving, Adam would find a moment alone. He would raise the sword of power toward the direction of Castle Grayskull in the distance. And he would speak words that became famous around the world. Words that millions of children repeated in living rooms and playgrounds. "By the power of Grayskull, I have the power!" In that moment, which the show depicted with lightning and dramatic music, everything about Adam changed. His body transformed. His physical strength multiplied to superhuman levels. He became He-Man, the most powerful man in the universe, Eternia's greatest defender. But here's what made it special, what separated He-Man from other strong cartoon heroes. He didn't just rely on physical strength to win battles. He used strategy. He used his mind. He solved problems and outsmarted enemies instead of simply punching through obstacles. The show was teaching something without stating it directly. Real power comes from thinking, not just fighting. Only 3 people in the entire kingdom knew Adam's secret. The sorceress, who watched over Castle Grayskull from inside its walls. Man-at-Arms, whose real name was Duncan, the master inventor and weapons expert who served the royal family. And Orko, a small floating magician from another dimension called Trolla, where magic apparently worked differently than it did on Eternia. On Eternia, Orko's spells usually failed in comedic ways, providing humor in a show that was otherwise focused on action and conflict. But he was loyal to Adam, and he kept the secret without question. Everyone else in the kingdom, including people who fought alongside He-Man regularly, believed Adam was exactly what he appeared to be: a disappointment, a prince who would never live up to his potential. Even Teela, who was closer to Adam than almost anyone, never suspected the truth. Teela was the captain of the Royal Guard, one of the most skilled warriors in all of Eternia. She had been trained by Man-at-Arms, who had adopted her as his daughter when she was young. She fought alongside He-Man in nearly every battle against Skeletor's forces. She was brave, capable, and respected throughout the kingdom, but she was also something she didn't know about herself. The show eventually revealed that she was actually the biological daughter of the sorceress. The secret had been kept from her to protect her from dangers that came with that knowledge. She trained alongside Prince Adam regularly, often expressing frustration at his apparent laziness and lack of commitment, never knowing that the clumsy prince she criticized was also the hero she fought beside. Man-at-Arms was more than just the royal inventor and weapons maker. He was a teacher, a strategist, a father figure to both Teela and Adam. He led the elite military forces defending Eternos. He created the advanced weapons, vehicles, and technology that helped in the fight against Skeletor's magic and schemes. He understood something important that the show demonstrated repeatedly. Battles were won with preparation and intelligence as much as they were won with courage and strength. And then there was Battle Cat, He-Man's armored mount and companion in battle. He had a secret identity too, mirroring Adam's dual nature. Most of the time, he was Cringer, a green tiger who lived in the royal palace and was afraid of nearly everything. Loud noises, danger, conflict of any kind. He was the opposite of what you'd expect from a tiger. But when Adam transformed into He-Man, the Sword of Power also transformed Cringer into Battle Cat, a fearless warrior animal wearing red armor and a helmet, ready to charge into any battle. Even the animals in this world lived with hidden strength and dual identities. Every episode of He-Man and the Masters of the Universe followed a pattern. The pattern was predictable, but it worked because children knew what to expect and wanted exactly that. Skeletor would develop a plan: steal an ancient weapon, capture one of He-Man's allies, attack a vulnerable location in Eternia, launch an assault on the royal palace, something that would bring him closer to Castle Grayskull and its power. He-Man would discover the plan, usually through the sorceress warning him or through someone reporting Skeletor's movements. Then he would stop it. The battles that followed were carefully constructed to follow rules that television had to obey at that time. Rules set by the Federal Communications Commission about what children could watch. He-Man used wrestling moves, throws and holds. He would lift enemies and toss them aside. He would block attacks and deflect weapons. But he never punched people in the face. He never used his sword to cut or hurt anyone. The violence had to be limited and non-graphic. The sword was used for defense, for channeling power, for dramatic gestures, not for harming people on screen. 130 episodes were produced between 1983 and 1985. They aired in weekday syndication, meaning they appeared on local television stations rather than on one of the 3 major networks. The show did something that cartoons in the previous decade couldn't do. It broke through the very strict rules from the 1970s that had limited superhero action and violence on children's television. It was allowed to exist because it was directly connected to toy sales, and because it did one additional thing that made parents, educators, and television regulators accept it. At the end of every single episode, without exception, one of the characters would return to the screen after the story concluded. They would look directly at the camera, speaking to the children watching. For about 30 seconds, they would explain a moral lesson connected to what had just happened in that episode. Be responsible for your actions. Tell the truth, even when it's difficult. Help your friends when they need you. Be brave in the face of danger. Don't judge people by how they look on the outside. Share with others. Listen to your parents. The lessons were simple, sometimes even obvious, but they served a very specific purpose. The show had to prove it was educational, not just entertainment designed to sell toys. It had to demonstrate to parents, teachers, and government regulators that children were learning valuable social lessons while watching muscular heroes fight skeleton-faced villains. These 30-second segments at the end of each episode were the compromise that allowed everything else to exist, and for several years, that compromise worked to keep everyone satisfied. By 1985, He-Man wasn't just a popular cartoon. It was everywhere. It had become a cultural phenomenon that dominated childhood in a way that's difficult to explain to anyone who wasn't there to experience it. Toy sales reached $400 million in 1986. To put that number in perspective, that was more money than Star Wars toys were making. More than Barbie. He-Man had become the single biggest toy franchise in the entire world. The same company that had missed out on Star Wars had created something even bigger. The success went beyond just the action figures. There were comic books from DC and later from other publishers, expanding the stories and mythology. There were books for young readers. There were vehicles kids could buy, like the Attack Track and the Wind Raider. There were playsets, including Castle Grayskull itself, which you could purchase and open and use to stage your own battles. New characters were constantly being introduced through mini-comics that came packaged with the toys. These comics would tell a short story featuring a new character, and then weeks later, that same character would appear in an episode of the cartoon. Everything was connected. The toys supported the show. The show supported the toys. The comics supported both. It was a cycle that fed itself and grew larger with each rotation. The phrase, "I have the power," entered popular culture in a way that transcended the franchise. People who had never watched a single episode knew those words. It became a reference point, a piece of shared cultural language for an entire generation. That's how completely He-Man dominated the mid-1980s. It wasn't just popular, it was inescapable. But while He-Man was at the absolute peak of its success, while toy sales were breaking records and the show was reaching millions of children every day, something was already changing that nobody in charge recognized until it was too late. By 1987, the entire franchise fell apart. The collapse was so sudden and so complete that it shocked everyone involved. Toy sales dropped from $400 million to $7 million in a single year. That's a 98% drop. Almost total destruction of the market in 12 months. Store owners and toy retailers were furious. Their shelves were packed with He-Man figures they couldn't sell. Mattel had overproduced, flooding the market with far more toys than children wanted to buy. Everyone who was interested in He-Man already owned the main characters. Everyone who wanted Castle Grayskull already had it in their home. There was nowhere left for the market to grow. At the exact same time, something new appeared that fundamentally changed what children wanted. Video games. Specifically, the Nintendo Entertainment System, which launched in North America in 1986. For the first time, children could control adventures themselves. They could make decisions. They could win or lose based on their own skills. They could save princesses and defeat villains through their own actions, not through imagination. Action figures required imagination. You had to create the stories. You had to provide the voices. You had to make the choices about what happened next. Video games didn't require any of that. The story was built in. The action was on the screen. And slowly at first, then very quickly, children's preferences shifted away from imaginative play with plastic figures. There were other problems compounding the collapse. She-Ra, Princess of Power, the spin-off show that launched in 1985, was designed to appeal to girls. But it focused on dolls rather than action figures that could be used alongside He-Man toys. The audience fragmented instead of expanding. Boys who loved He-Man didn't want She-Ra dolls. Girls who might have been interested in She-Ra weren't necessarily interested in He-Man. The Filmation animated series had already ended production in 1985 after reaching 130 episodes. Without new episodes driving interest and introducing new characters, the momentum couldn't be maintained. By 1987, the cultural moment that had made He-Man the biggest toy franchise in the world had completely passed. It was replaced by new technologies, new expectations, and new forms of entertainment that made imaginative play with action figures feel like it belonged to a different era. But that wasn't the end of the story. The franchise didn't disappear forever. It kept returning, kept reinventing itself for new audiences who hadn't been there the first time. Each return tried to capture some of what made the original special while updating it for a new generation with different expectations. She-Ra, despite the problems with toy compatibility, became her own lasting icon. The character inspired people for decades, and eventually got her own successful reboot. A live-action film starring Dolph Lundgren arrived in theaters in 1987, attempting to bring He-Man to a wider audience beyond children. The New Adventures of He-Man launched in 1989, trying to transport the character into a more science fiction-focused future setting. A complete reboot of the original series arrived in 2002 with significantly improved animation and deeper exploration of Eternia's history and mythology. That version lasted 2 seasons and introduced He-Man to a new generation of children who had never seen the 1980s original. More recently, Netflix has released 2 new animated series: Masters of the Universe, Revelation in 2021, which continued the story of the original series with the characters aged and changed; Masters of the Universe, Revolution in 2024, which continued that narrative even further. Both shows attempted to honor what came before, while adding more complex storytelling that appealed to adults who had grown up with the franchise. Comic books from various publishers have continued exploring the mythology, sometimes following the original continuity, sometimes creating entirely new interpretations. In 2020, Mattel launched the Origins toy line, which brought back the original design aesthetic from the 1980s for adult collectors who wanted to hold those figures one more time and remember what it felt like to believe in Eternia. What Filmation and Mattel created together in 1983 became a template that influenced the entire entertainment industry. The idea that toys and animated shows could be developed in tandem, with each supporting and promoting the other, became standard practice for decades. The specific creative choices they made, mixing medieval fantasy with science fiction technology, adding moral lessons to justify toy advertising, creating transformation sequences that became cultural touchstones, those were all products of their specific time and circumstances. But they also created something that proved to be permanent in the memories of everyone who experienced it during childhood. Because here's what matters more than the sales figures or the episode counts, or the number of times the franchise has been rebooted for new audiences. For those of us who were there, who watched those episodes every weekday afternoon, who played with those action figures until the joints broke and the accessories got lost, He-Man represented something specific that we've carried with us ever since. It was about the moment you held that plastic sword and imagined yourself saying those words. It was about believing that power could be hidden, that the person everyone underestimated could secretly be the hero when it actually mattered. It was about sitting on the floor with your friends or your siblings and deciding which characters you would be, which battles you would fight, which version of Eternia you would create in the space between the television and your imagination. The show gave us permission to believe in transformation. Not just physical transformation, but the idea that you could be more than what people saw on the surface. That strength could be secret, that who you appeared to be and who you actually were could be 2 completely different things. Now you know the complete story. You know it started with a corporate mistake and a desperate attempt to compete with Star Wars. You know it was designed to sell toys first and tell stories second. You know it succeeded beyond anyone's expectations and then collapsed almost overnight when the market changed. You know it kept coming back, over and over, because something about it refused to be forgotten. And maybe now you understand why it mattered. It wasn't just nostalgia. It wasn't just childhood memories fading with time. He-Man gave an entire generation something real. A framework for understanding hidden potential. A belief that transformation was possible. A daily reminder that power could belong to anyone, even someone everyone else overlooked. Eternia isn't real. Castle Grayskull never held any actual power. The sorceress cannot transform into a falcon. Skeletor never threatened anything except 30 minutes of our attention each day. We've always known these things. But the feeling those stories created, the belief they instilled, the way they shaped how we saw ourselves and what we thought we could become, that was completely real. You know the truth about He-Man now. But there's another hero from that same era whose story is just as fascinating. A driver who didn't need magic or transformation, just a steering wheel, a white helmet with a letter on it, and a car that could do impossible things. Speed Racer came before He-Man, influenced what came after, and left its own mark on everyone who watched it. I've put together the complete story of Speed Racer with the same level of detail and respect. If you want to understand another piece of what shaped your childhood, click the video on your screen or check the description below. Let's keep uncovering these stories together. I'll see you there.